Welcome back to the Ultimate DBD Lore Tier List, where I rank every single character's lore in DBD from S tier to F tier. I'll be ranking each character's lores based off the criteria of how intriguing a character's lore is, how convoluted it is, if there's plot holes, and certain personal preferences. This is what the tier list looks like so far. If you disagree with my rankings, be sure to let me know how wrong I am in the comments down below. It won't matter though, because I'm right and you're wrong. While you're there, if you enjoyed this video, consider dropping a like, and if you haven't already, consider subscribing. It helps me out a ton. If you want to see more tier list types of videos in the future, be sure to let me know. Lastly, I want to remind you all that outside of the series, I will not be making any other DBD videos in the future, so just a fair warning. Anyways, without further ado, let's get into the lore of Jane Romero. Up next, we've got Jane Romero. Jane grew up being raised by her father, as her mother was a famous actress who was absent for practically all of Jane's life. Despite holding so much resentment for her mother, Jane also admired her mother and aspired to be also a famous actress. However, Jane ended up having a hard time ever landing a job in the entertainment industry, despite having a knack for performing. Jane would often lose out on acting gigs because the studio didn't like how she delivered her lines in a frank manner, or how she didn't like how her race was used as a punchline in shows or movies she got roles in. Eventually, Jane managed to get a role as a co-host for a failing talk show, where she managed to save and grow its viewership. After 2 years, Jane was then able to get her own TV show, effectively becoming the DBD universe's Oprah Winfrey. Although the show was extremely successful, tragedy struck one day when Jane's mother agreed to be interviewed on Jane's show, where her mother lies during the interview, saying that her and Jane aren't related. This disastrous interview led Jane to drive back to her father's house, and she ended up trying to take a shortcut to avoid traffic, which led her to a coastal highway covered in black ice. And with Jane feeling tired, she fell asleep at the wheel, leading her to crash into the ocean, where the entity then took her. If I'm gonna be honest, I think Jane's lore is a bit, boring. Like, it's not bad or anything, I just think it's pretty boring. Like, it's practically just a tale of bootleg Oprah. So, because his lore is boring, but not bad, I'm gonna put Jane's lore in C tier. Up next, we've got the Plague, aka Adiris. Look, I'm gonna say it right now, if you're going purely based off a character's base lore, Adiris' lore would be the easiest S tier ever. However, if you've watched this far into the tier list, then you know the one thing I hate the most in Dead by Daylight lore is when they create the most random and unnecessary ass retcons that turn a character from some sad, tragic person into some evil murderer. The best example I have of this is a nurse who initially was a woman driven mad by being surrounded by madness, who was then retconned into being a eugenicist who believes mentally impure people should be murdered. Anyways, long story short, behavior once again retconned a tragic character into being a bad person, where in Adiris' case, went from being a character who never had murderous intentions and was misled, to now being someone who committed murder because her god told her to do it. Rant aside, let's get into her lore. Growing up in ancient Babylon, Adiris was abandoned on the steps of the Temple of Purgation at the age of 5, where she was raised by the high priest Haban, and ever since then, she held on to the hope that God had a plan for her. Ever since her abandonment, Adiris' days would consist of working in the temple during the day, and at night, praying to her god for a sign of what her purpose is. When Adiris grew older, she then became an assistant to the priests, helping with swinging a censer during the yearly worshipping of the sea goat, or assisting with cleansing people afflicted with the plague that had struck Babylon, or assisting with the human sacrifices for the sea goat. During one of these human sacrifices, Adiris knows Haban crying over the man that was sacrificed, who is a friend of Haban. Haban reveals to Adiris that as a high priest, he plans on ending the traditions of human sacrifice, which shocks Adiris, seeing this as blasphemy. Despite her shock towards Haban's blasphemy towards the sea goat, she also begins to feel her faith faltering, and just as she comes to the decision that she must abandon the temple, she then has her prayers answered and hears a whisper. When Adiris hears this whisper, her faith in the sea goat becomes strengthened, and she ultimately decides that Haban is a blasphemer and must be punished accordingly. At night, Adiris seeks out Haban and finds him in the temple, where she gouges out his eyes and beats him to death with her censer. With the high priest dead and all the priests being too ill from the plague, the only one capable of performing any priestly duties was Adiris. Although nervous, Adiris excelled at her duties, and her followers' devotion for her was only reinforced when Adiris severed her own toe as a sacrifice to the gods to save a woman dying of the plague. This act ended up making all her followers unanimously agree upon making Adiris the new high priestess. Despite being so highly revered by the general population, people began questioning her when she too contracted the plague, and in shame, Adiris wore a veil and carried around a censer to mask her vile smell. Despite all her efforts, nothing worked, and as a last resort, she banished herself to save her people, being followed into the wilderness by a few devoted followers. Eventually, they were all forced to stop in a cave, where they were all too sick and tired to keep going. And in a final effort to save her people, Adiris made one final prayer to her god. However, it wasn't the sea goat that responded to her call, but rather the entity, who took her and her followers. I'm very disappointed by Adiris' lore, because if she didn't have her tome lore, this would be an extremely fascinating tragic tale of a woman who never killed a person in their life, who in a last-ditch effort prayed to her god for salvation, but instead an eldritch abomination responded to her call. However, with the introduction of her tome lore, much like Nurse, Behavior retconned her into being an evil murderer. I just don't get why Behavior had to make it so that Adiris was always worshipping the entity instead of leaving it as something more tragic and unsettling, as Adiris accidentally summoning the entity with her final prayer. In my opinion, it would have been a lot more interesting if Behavior left Adiris' lore without her ever spilling blood, as it would be a lot more unsettling having the implication that because what she assumed was her god saved her, she would kill for it because it demanded as repayment for saving her and her people. So because of how irritating this retcon is, I'm gonna have to drop Plague's lore all the way from S tier to C tier. Look who's shitting in the tall grass. Up next, we've got Ash Williams. For once, we finally have a licensed character whose lore isn't just a recap of what happened in the piece of media they're from. So, let's see how Behavior did with making creative liberties for Ash. Ash's first paragraph of his lore does recap the events of the Ash vs. Evil Dead TV series, with the recap ending at Ash being taken to the future. When Ash woke up, he heard a voice, which he seeked out, wearing only a pair of boxers. When he found the source of the voice, he discovered that it was a girl he had a fling with in high school, who's butt booty naked. Now, Ash being Ash, against his better judgment, was about to get freaky with her. And because he was blinded by his horniness, he didn't even realize she was a deadite until she stabbed him in the hand. Despite her getting the drop on him, Ash's tenacity let him get the upper hand on her by poking her in the eyes with soap. After defeating the demon, Ash makes a deal with her, where in return for not killing her, she sends Ash back home to his friends. The demon agreed and provided Ash with an incantation that would send him home. However, once again, Ash being Ash, totally fucking butchers this incantation. Instead, the room filled with filthy water, and once he was submerged, Ash found himself in the entity's realm. Okay, I'm gonna be honest, for the first ever licensed character whose lore has creative liberties, Behavior knocked it out of the fucking park with Ash. I swear to God, his entire lore plays out like a goddamn gag from Evil Dead. Whether it's Ash's horny brain putting him in terrible situations, or the stupid ass fight scene utilizing soap to the eyes to gain the upper hand, or Ash's butchering of an incantation, I absolutely adore how faithful this lore is to the original material. So, because of how faithful Ash's lore is to his character, and how Evil Dead-esque Ash's lore is, I can't put Ash's lore anywhere lower than S tier, making Ash the first ever survivor on this list going into S tier. Up next, we've got the Ghostface, aka Danny Johnson, aka Jed Olsen, aka Mr. I'm making direct eye contact with you, how haven't you been broken out of Night Shroud? Ghostface is an interesting licensed character, as contrary to popular belief, he isn't actually Ghostface from Scream, but actually Ghostface, the costume made by Funworld. Because of the fact that Ghostface isn't a person, but rather just a costume, Ghostface is a completely original character in DBD, so we don't have to worry about having a recap being his lore. Not much is actually known about Danny's early life, other than the fact that he gained his obsession with committing murders because of his deep appreciation for horror stories that he was told as a kid from his father, some of his favorites being true stories his father would tell. Danny's father would encourage Danny to create his own horror stories, which he did, just not in the way his father would have hoped. As he got older, Danny would attend college, where he'd express his bleak and pessimistic views through arguing with his anthropology professor, where the professor believed in the indomitable human spirit, whereas Danny believes that humans are natural evil killers. Now, unfortunately, it's not really known when Danny started killing people or what even took place between Danny's time in college to entering Roseville. However, the main part of Danny's lore takes place in the northern Floridan town of Roseville. Danny eventually left his hometown in Utah, going from town to town working various jobs under the alias Jed Olsen. Danny's final town he ended up in before getting taken is the aforementioned Roseville, and feeling notably more emboldened, decided to work as a journalist who would report on his own murders, like some kind of fucked up Spider-Man. During his time in Roseville, we get a good sense of how twisted and meticulous Danny could be when planning his murders, taking into consideration things like targeting someone with the biggest Joe Schmo name ever, just to strike fear into people who have generic names like John and Michael. Or when he targets a victim, he makes sure to meticulously design how he'd go about killing his victims, often including ways he'd toy with his victims, such as constantly opening a victim's fridge so his victims would have to get out of bed to close it. Despite his cold and calculating attitude towards his murders, Danny isn't immune to breaking his composure. And one of these instances where this happened was when he discovered 3 dude bros were mocking Danny by making caricatures of the Ghostface, calling him the urban farce. What sets Danny over the edge with these guys, though, is when he discovers their mockeries of other infamous killers, including what's implied to be Evan McMillan, which leads Danny to, instead of following through with his calculated plan to murdering these 3 guys, to violently and sloppily kill these 3 guys in a laser tag arena, where Danny frames one of the 3 guys for the murder. One day, in true murderous Spider-Man fashion, Danny produced footage where the Ghostface breaks into a house, titling this footage Ghostface Caught on Tape. Following the production of this footage, Danny confessed to his crimes by leaving a note on his desk, where he'd then go into hiding. As he was packing up and preparing to leave Roseville, a fog engulfed him, and was then taken by the entity. So, I have very mixed feelings about Danny's lore. On one hand, I think it's very cool that Behavior created a killer who's a cold, calculating psychopath, who's good at what he does, while also avoiding getting caught without being under the protection of any government bodies or dumb luck, like Herman Carter or Kenneth Chase. However, I do have one huge gripe with Danny's lore, and that's how there's no real context given to why Danny's such a deranged killer. I suppose an excuse be made that his motivation is hearing the stories his father told him as a child. However, I still have a hard time believing that his motivation is purely based on that. It also doesn't exactly help that we don't even know what or when Danny's first kill even was, as it could provide some insight on how Danny got to where he is now. The only assumption I can make is I feel as though he probably started after his time in college, as I feel like being a college student, Danny wouldn't have been able to afford all the resources he'd need to stalk and murder his victims. So because of this massive gap in information, I think I'm gonna have to put Danny Johnson's lore in B tier. Up next, we have another one of my absolute goats in my first ever P100, Steve Harrington. Unfortunately, despite Steve being an awesome character, his lore is insanely lackluster. I don't know why, but Behavior effectively did what they did with Myers and Laurie's lore for all the Stranger Things characters. The first half of Steve's lore is a recap, and the second half is how he got tricked by the Entity into going into the Hawkins lab, where he's then brought to the Entity's realm. As you all probably know by now, I'm not fond of these recap lores. Steve's lore is going into D tier, with the only thing saving him from F tier being the small bit explaining how he got into the Entity's realm. Up next, we've got Nancy Wheeler. Her lore is the same deal as Steve's. It's a recap, then her lore says how she got taken while investigating Hawkins. D tier. Next up is Demogorgon. Surprisingly, Demogorgon's lore is on par with Myers' lore. I really thought they were done with these, but clearly not. Demogorgon's lore is literally just a description of the Demogorgon. This just doesn't bring anything new to the table. F tier. Up next, we've got Yui Kimura. As of writing the script, Tome 20 just released, which has more lore for Yui. And let me tell you, I was so scared that Behavior was going to pull a David on Yui because of Twitter again. But surprisingly, her new tome doesn't go into anything related to her sexual orientation whatsoever. As I said in David's section, I don't care if a character is part of the LGBTQ community. However, I do find it really irritating when it's confirmed in such a forced way, such as a second tome that exists for the sole purpose of retconning a character's orientation. Also, as I said in David's section, if you do have an issue with a character in a video game being LGBT, then kindly fuck off from this video. You aren't welcome here. With love, a trans lesbian. Okay, I'm getting very sidetracked here. Let's get into Yui's lore. Yui grew up with a very traditional upbringing in the small Japanese town of Hida. It was there where Yui began to race scooters, much to her parents' disapproval. Despite this, Yui's grandmother heavily encouraged her to pursue her passion and gifted her grandfather's old engineering manuals. With the help of these manuals, Yui souped up her scooter, which ended up causing her to constantly win motocross races with boys. Unfortunately, when Yui told her parents about her passion for racing, she became estranged from her parents and got kicked out of the house. Moving from Hida to Nagoya was difficult for Yui, as she had to work terrible jobs like as a hostess in a hostess club just to make ends meet. However, when Yui managed to purchase a motorcycle, she ended up racing in street races where, much like in her hometown scooter races, she constantly win. However, this time she won cash prizes, which paid way more than her hostess jobs ever did. Though unfortunately, this wouldn't be the end of her problem, as she would make lots of enemies, and worst of all, she had a stalker. Despite having belongings such as her lucky handkerchief being stolen, the police, much like in real life, do absolutely nothing about it and laugh it off, which ends up leading to the stalker attacking Yui in her apartment with a knife. Following this run-in, she formed a motorcycle gang called the Sakura 7, who'd wear pink hachimakis in solidarity of women dealing with abusers and stalkers. As the Sakura 7 kept growing in members, Yui would keep winning races, and at one point won 7 races in a row, leading to her getting a sponsorship. However, Yui's troubles didn't end with the stalker, as she's been having a reoccurring nightmare of her being chased by an Oni while riding her motorcycle, speeding past a rider who's crashed and attempting to escape their burning wreck, where she then crashes and gets incapacitated as the Oni approaches her. Yui and her friend Masato believe this to be a sign that Yui's overachieving. However, we all know this is a premonition for what's to come. Following this conversation, Yui encourages her friend Hiro to win a race as another rider, Shinji, shit-talks Yui. During this race, Shinji causes Hiro to be permanently crippled by intentionally fucking with him during the race. This leads Yui to have dark thoughts about Shinji. However, she never acts upon them. After visiting Hiro in the hospital, Yui gets invited to a secret race, which is sponsored by a billionaire. And as it turns out, Shinji ends up being in this race too, where he tries getting into Yui's head through shit-talking and threatening. However, in response, Yui almost seems to curse Shinji by guaranteeing he'll crash and burn. And lo and behold, Shinji did end up crashing and burning. However, despite all of Yui's disdain for the guy, she still decided to stop racing and drag him out of the burning wreck. And as a reward for this action, I believe the guy who won the race offered up the prize money to Yui. If I'm gonna be honest, I really can't tell if the winner's offering the money or flexing it, as there's no dialogue. However, I personally think he's offering up the money. Sometime after this race, Yui gets a phone call from none other than her mother, who Yui's had minimal contact with since she got kicked out. Before even answering the phone, Yui realized what this phone call is about, and that's her grandmother passing. This phone call leads Yui to think about her parents again, imagining several scenarios with herself in them. from them apologizing for removing her from their lives, to them kicking her out of the funeral. However, despite all these fantasies about what her parents will do, and how Yui will pretend to not care, when the funeral actually happens, Yui's interactions with her parents are very minimal and cordial. This leads Yui to leave the funeral with a new revelation that she needs to stop living in the past and also to stop racing. Despite having this revelation, Yui still continued racing, and during an illegal Tokyo street race, Yui was taken by the entity in front of all the onlookers as she drove into a black fog. Yui's lore is very interesting to me, as it's a classic tale of someone who achieves their goals and ambitions despite their family being vehemently against these aspirations. It also felt so real during her new tome's lore about her grandma's funeral, specifically when it came to Yui thinking of all the ways the interactions with her parents would go, as anyone who's had bad fights with family or has dealt with estrangement had probably at one point or another had the exact same thoughts Yui did. I also think that Yui's lore is interesting when it comes to how she keeps having premonitions of what happens during the Cursed Legacy trailer. Dreams about the entity's realm does seem to be a reoccurring theme with characters in DBD. I do think that's a bit overdone in this game though, as dreams are, at least to me, a pretty lazy way to portray a premonition about the future. I think the only other nitpick I have with her lore is that there's a little plot hole between her leaving her grandma's funeral and her getting taken by the entity. I get that what probably happened is that Yui won one last race before retiring, and I also recognize I'm not a child who needs every little thing spelled out to me, but still, Yui seems so certain about retiring during her new tome lore. Although I like this lore, it wasn't necessarily a very profound or original lore, so because it was enjoyable but bland, I'm gonna put Yui's lore in high B tier. Up next, we have the Oni, aka Kazan Yamaoka. Oh man, outside of hillbilly, behavior loves mentioning Kazan in lore. Whether it's being briefly mentioned in Saku's lore or being implied to be Rin's ancient ancestor. Kazan's lore is a little bit difficult for me to compile, since apparently the Kazan in Saku's timeline is an alternate universe version of Kazan, and also his tome lore is formatted in behavior's new favorite obnoxious way they do with pretty much all of the tome lore now, that being memory fragments, which are totally disorganized pieces of lore, but that doesn't matter for all you watching this video, because Mama Marcy is here to organize it for you. So let's get into Kazan Yamaoka's lore. Quite literally nothing is known about Kazan's early life. The most that we do know about Kazan growing up is that he has a deep respect for samurai culture and his father's legacy as a legendary samurai, and that he has a deep hatred for the decline of the samurai, with farmers pretending to be samurai. Kazan's story begins when he's a grown adult. He's very clearly a family-oriented man, and will sometimes go to extreme lengths for his family, such as when his son broke his leg falling out of a tree. Kazan, quote, punished his son's playmate and her family. Although we can only assume that when it says punish, it's likely they murdered the child and her family. However, the types of extremes Kazan would go for his family aren't all murderous, as Kazan would trek to a winter temple 100 times just to pray for his son to heal, to the point where his toenails would blacken and fall off. It's not really clear what sparked this pilgrimage, but one day Kazan was fed up with farmers and peasants pretending to be samurai, and Kazan took a kanabo, his generational katana, and some of his father's weapons, and went on a pilgrimage to slaughter anyone he deemed to be an imposter samurai. Kazan's pilgrimage covered the entirety of Japan, ranging from the forests to the beaches. Kazan would horrifically murder farmers posing as samurai by scalping them and removing their top knots. Sometimes, Kazan wouldn't just go after imposter samurai, he'd also go after foreigners who he deemed to be destroying Japanese culture. Despite being such a feared and hated individual, Kazan actually somehow managed to make friends, or at least one friend. That being a man named Shuzo. Shuzo informed Kazan over tea, amongst other things, that there were some foreign traders who were going against the shogun's tariffs, and implying that Kazan should get rid of them. During the night while the traders were docked at the Daijima dock in Nagasaki, Kazan ambushed the traders, slaughtering all of them, nearly getting shot by one of them, and then torching their ship. Word would eventually spread throughout Japan of Kazan's bloody pilgrimage, and one day while traveling to a village, Kazan was ambushed in a river by nearly a dozen imposter samurai, all of whom were taken down with ease by Kazan. After this bloodbath, Kazan was attacked by surprise from behind by a teenager who referred to him as an Oni. This deeply disturbed Kazan, as to him, he thought he was doing Japan a service by murdering fake samurai and traitors defying the shogun. These Oni remarks led Kazan to his breaking point when a noble lord referred to him as Oni Yamaoka, which Kazan saw as both an insult to himself and his family. This led him to head directly to the town the noble lived in, slaughtering anyone who'd refer to him as Oni Yamaoka. As Kazan journeyed to the noble's town, he was stopped by an actual samurai, not just a farmer wearing stolen armor. This samurai nearly killed Kazan. However, the samurai briefly hesitated, which gave Kazan an opening to bash the samurai's head in with his kanabo. But, to Kazan's horror, he saw that the samurai he just attacked was none other than his own father. And in his father's last moments, he gave Kazan a shameful look. With this realization, Kazan screamed until he blacked out. And even further to Kazan's horror, he realized that during his time when he blacked out, thieves stole his father's body to take his armor. After the murder of his father, Kazan mindlessly wandered Japan, seemingly forgetting his reason for traveling the direction he had in the first place, until he then remembered the noble who called him Oni Yamaoka, which caused him to immediately head in the direction of the noble's town again. Ironically enough, Kazan wasn't even killing fake samurai anymore. When he reached the gate of the town, Kazan murdered a dozen real samurai and slaughtered his way to the villa where this noble is hiding. When Kazan reached the noble, he tortured the noble by cutting his tendons and then ripping out the noble's tongue as punishment for calling him Oni Yamaoka. Despite being a vicious warrior who could take down at least a dozen people at once with relative ease, Kazan finally met his match when he was faced with several dozen farmers after murdering the lord. Although Kazan did hold his own for a bit, he was ultimately overpowered and tortured by the mob, where they then dragged him to a stone mill, where they then tortured him even more, and after leaving him to die a slow death, when they returned, both his body and Kunabo were gone, as he was then taken by the entity, where he continued to be constantly tormented. Despite there not being too much background info on why Kazan's the way he is, I actually found this lore to be extremely fascinating. You know, something I really enjoyed about this lore is the interesting take on Japan's nationalism, and that era's version of classism. Now look, I'm by no means a history buff, and I don't know if it's true that during the decline of the samurai, farmers and peasants would pose as samurai, but what I do know is that during the Edo period, farmers could potentially be promoted to being samurai. And knowing human nature, I can only assume that during this era, some samurai would be infuriated with the knowledge that farmers could also be samurai. It honestly wouldn't be hard to imagine how a samurai such as Kazan could develop such hatred and animosity for these farmers turned samurai. The other thing I liked about this lore is how unique Kazan's motivations are for his murders. A lot of killers, as expected, are driven by some sick desire for pleasure from murdering people, such as Ghostface or Clown. However, Kazan isn't driven by desire or pleasure. Kazan's driven by his own twisted perception of what's right and honorable. And it's not just something that he, at least consciously, uses as an excuse to indiscriminately murder people. Kazan truly believes he's doing Japan a service and is preserving the honor and legacy of the samurai. Now, I will say though, I think my biggest gripe with this lore is how it definitely sometimes becomes very unrealistic, even by Dead by Daylight standards. I get that it's trying to portray Kazan as some terrifying killing machine who seems practically unstoppable. However, it was extremely difficult for me to suspend my disbelief when it was explicitly stated that Kazan took down around a dozen people at once twice. And the second time it happened, it wasn't even farmers. It was actual trained samurai who were skilled enough to defend Noble Lord's town. It also took me out a bit during his tome cutscene when he murdered the traitors, as it even showed in the cutscene that at least one of them had a gun. However, not a single one of them decided to shoot him. So as much as I really want to put Kazan's lore in S tier for being very engaging and also painting a very interesting picture of who Kazan is as a person, because of the somewhat over-the-top unrealistic fights, I can't put the Oni's lore anywhere higher than A tier. Up next, we've got my girl Zarina Kassir, who I'm currently working on making my second ever P100. She was also added during the Chains of Hate DLC, which was added right when I started playing DBD. But that's besides the point. Let's get into the lore. Even from a very young age, Zarina had deep interest in the news and standing up for what's right. One of the earliest instances of this was when she saw a newspaper article whose headline stated that anti-Arab hate is on the rise. That night, Zarina and her parents celebrate their nation's independence by watching fireworks, with her father particularly voicing his desire to watch them and celebrate. Despite her family's pride in their culture, growing up as a child of Lebanese immigrants in Brooklyn, Zarina tried to ditch her culture to evade bullies by pretending to be like her peers, by dyeing her hair, throwing away her lunches, and going by the name Katrina. However, despite this, Zarina would still get bullied, particularly by a girl named Lindsay, who Zarina ended up clocking in the face when Zarina perceived it as standing up to racism. Despite thinking what she did was right, her father explained that she should never let racists like Lindsay get into her head or her heart, as it ultimately means they won. This new identity Zarina created for herself all came crumbling down when her mother confronted her about this new identity she made for herself, which made her realize she doesn't want to be Katrina. As she got older, she embraced her culture again. Though the other thing she also embraced was her passion for journalism. With her parents always having the news playing on the TV, Zarina was eventually inspired to use her father's camera to do her own journalism, interviewing people in Bay Ridge and posting these interviews online. However, Zarina moved on from internet journalism after the news picked up on one of Zarina's exposés and spun the situation in the favor of a restaurant abusing their employees. This incident led Zarina to instead become a filmmaker and producer, and after creating a film for a competition at school, she ended up getting first prize, which sparked her career as a filmmaker. However, tragedy eventually struck one day when there was CCTV footage of her father being murdered under mysterious circumstances in broad daylight, where he was pushed into oncoming traffic. Despite this being clearly intentional murder, which was even caught clearly on camera, her father's murderer was only given a measly 10-year sentence, which infuriated Zarina to the point where she would create an entire film about her father's murder. For this film, Zarina traveled to the prison where her father's murderer was transferred to, that being the Hellshire Penitentiary. At this prison, Zarina interviewed her father's murderer, and after enough button pressing, she managed to get a confession out of him. This film Zarina made ended up getting international acclaim, and that led to other inmates from Hellshire Penitentiary to reach out to her in hopes of ending up in one of her films. However, the one that really stuck out to her was that when an inmate told her that an entire wing of the penitentiary was closed off because of an incident known as the Mad, I can't say that word, massacre, where an outlaw and his gang slaughtered the warden and guards in the penitentiary. Knowing that the official story was rarely ever the real story, Zarina did her own investigating of the outlaw and the massacre, and discovered a record of an Irish immigrant who was sentenced for 15 years in 1860 for assault. Knowing this, she traveled back to Hellshire Penitentiary and snuck her way into the sealed off section of the prison until she found the cell that belonged to the outlaw. When she found the cell, she discovered a wrench and an inscription on the wall that said "Death to Bayshore." And when she looked to the ground, she saw her father's contorted body as she was enveloped by fog and taken by the entity. Zarina's lore is decently interesting. It sheds light on what life is like growing up in America as a non-white person. A good bit of what Zarina's childhood was like is unfortunately a common tale for non-white kids in school. I could definitely relate a good bit to what Zarina's childhood was like. The other interesting thing about Zarina's lore is how it covers the harsh reality of most media rarely ever telling the full story of a situation, and how Zarina decided to take matters into her own hands to tell the unbiased truth, which made her into an internationally acclaimed documentarian. Honestly, I don't have much negative to say about this lore. I will say though, similarly to Jane's lore, this lore is a bit bland to me. So because this lore is a bit bland but has some interesting aspects, I think I'll put Zarina's lore on top of B tier. Up next, we've got the Deathslinger, aka Caleb Quinn. Now, I know I've not really ever mentioned this about any other characters in this tier list so far, but sometimes the characters in a DLC are supposed to contrast each other, almost like they're on opposite ends of the spectrum for one another. And I think the contrast between Zarina and Caleb are so fascinating. Both characters are children of immigrants, and they both face racial discrimination. However, the way they dealt with their discrimination were vastly different, with Zarina standing on business exposing the truth for the whole world to see, whereas Caleb would seethe in anger, fantasizing about the ways he could torture his bullies, constantly allowing himself to get stepped on. It's kind of like the Infamous series, where Cole or Delsing can deal with their discrimination over being a conduit by either being a hero who exposes the truth or a vengeful murderer. Okay, I'm getting a bit sidetracked. With that out of the way, let's get into Caleb's lore. Caleb was a child of poor Irish immigrants who constantly struggled to find work due to racial discrimination over them being Irish. Caleb's father was an engineer, which Caleb aspired to be, which eventually led to him creating his own contraptions. However, Caleb definitely displayed some signs of sociopathy, as he made an unnecessarily cruel trap for animals in the yard, with his reasoning being that he didn't want the animals to escape, much to his father's disappointment. This wasn't the only cruel thing Caleb would design, as he also made a schematic for a mask that would gouge eyes out with spikes, and fantasized about putting it on his bullies. As Caleb got older, he became such a skilled inventor that his race wasn't a deterrent for employers, and was eventually hired by a man named Henry Bayshore. Unfortunately for Caleb, he was blindsided by Bayshore, who manipulated Caleb with words of how lucky Caleb should be as Bayshore was putting a long line to keep him employed. All the while, Bayshore would steal the patents and inventions Caleb would create, while at the same time feigning indifference to the inventions. When Caleb discovered that his invention's patents were stolen by Bayshore, he lost it and beat the shit out of Bayshore. And right before Caleb could be restrained, he shot Bayshore in the gut with a special railroad spike gun, nailing Bayshore to his desk. Caleb managed to avoid hanging because Bayshore survived, and he was sentenced to 15 years in prison, where he'd end up befriending the only other educated person in the prison, that being the warden. Throughout his time in prison, they'd help each other out, with Caleb creating torture devices for the warden, and in return, he'd get extra food. Eventually, the warden even promised to frame and have Bayshore arrested under the condition that Caleb makes the warden rich by bringing outlaws to the prison. Under these conditions, Caleb alongside two of his prison buddies were allowed to leave the prison, and the warden even gave Caleb his spear gun, Death to Bayshore, back to him. Before riding out, Caleb modified his spear gun, adding a chain to it, and testing it on a thief who Caleb accidentally disemboweled. After a few modifications, Caleb eventually stopped disemboweling people. Eventually, Caleb and his buddies finally catch up to the target the warden wanted them to go after, and after blasting the guy in the leg with the spear gun, the boys successfully bring the guy back alive to the prison. As a reward, the warden released Irish inmates to join Caleb's gang so they could keep bringing people to the prison. Despite being a skilled gunslinger and bounty hunter, Caleb wouldn't go completely unharmed, as he had his jaw blown off during a shootout, or another time he got shot in the leg, leaving him with a limp. On one fateful day during a particularly bloody shootout in the town of Glenvale, Caleb saw a newspaper that showed none other than Henry Bayshore purchasing Hellshire Penitentiary. And, in a fit of rage, Caleb and his gang stormed back to the prison, slaughtering the guards, and when Caleb went to the warden's office, he saw not just the warden, but none other than Henry Bayshore too. With that, Caleb began beating and torturing Bayshore, while his gang beat and tortured the warden. With both men in excruciating agony, the gang dragged the warden and Bayshore to the general prison populace to finish them off. However, instead of joining the rest of the gang in finishing off Bayshore and the warden, Caleb decided to return to his cell, where he was then taken by the entity, greeted by a sight of everyone Caleb hated. Caleb's lore is another very fascinating killer tale that is unfortunately very historically accurate. Now, I want to make it clear that I'm no history buff or anything, but I do have a bit of interest in not so widely known historical information. And the historical accuracy in this lore is the racial discrimination Irish people had to face in America for years, only ending within the last not even 100 years. Caleb's story is a tale of Irish people who were often used and abused by people, and that fortunately for Caleb, the stars aligned for him to have his comeuppance. I do have one main issue with his lore though, and that's the plot hole of his spear gun. In his tome lore and his base lore, there's very conflicting information on how his spear gun came to be. His base lore makes it seem as though he kept accidentally killing bounties before eventually perfecting the spear gun, whereas in his tome lore, it seems as though he went straight from the prison to the saloon where him and his gang caught their first bounty. So as much as I really enjoyed this lore a lot, I can't help but focus on this plot hole. So although I want Caleb's lore to go into S tier, it's gonna have to be placed in A tier. Up next, we've got Cheryl Mason. Fortunately for me, and unfortunately for you, and unfortunately for you Silent Hill fans, unlike the past few lores, there's not too much yap for Cheryl's lore. Also unfortunately, much like 90% of all the licensed characters' lore so far, it's mostly just a recap, with it explaining how she got taken by the entity while working at a crisis center, when she took a phone call and heard Claudia's voice on the line. You already know how I feel about recaps. D tier. Up next, we got the Executioner, aka Pyramid Head. So I should probably mention I've never played Silent Hill, and I know both jack and shit about Silent Hill and its lore, so I apologize if I get anything wrong about what I'm going to say about Pyramid Head, or anything I said about Cheryl. Pyramid Head's lore once again is a recap, and ends with the entity inviting Pyramid Head to the realm. However, the weird thing about this lore is that if I'm not mistaken, Pyramid Head is a manifestation of James Sunderland's guilt, and is only visible to him. So how the hell would 1, he go to the entity's realm to punish people that aren't James, but then 2, why is the survivor in this chapter not James? At least then Pyramid Head and DBD would make a little bit more sense, because it would be like it following James into the realm. Anyways, Pyramid Head's lore is a recap and his presence makes no sense to me. F tier. Up next, we've got Felix Richter, aka DBD's sexy man everyone forgot about the second Vittorio got added to the game. Despite the DBD community practically treating this man like a total one-dimensional himbo, Felix's lore is actually surprisingly compelling. Growing up, Felix was raised by 2 very wealthy parents who were members of an ancient society known as the Illuminati. Oops, sorry, I meant the Imperiati. Because of his parents being wealthy physicians, both Felix and his parents were constantly traveling, which exposed Felix to a wide variety of cultures, and most importantly to Felix, architecture. Being an introvert, Felix primarily spent his free time studying, often reading up on history and architecture. Although his father was disappointed by how introverted Felix was, instead of punishing him, his father instead encouraged Felix's passions with architecture by helping him with wooden models, while telling Felix stories about how the Imperiati fight against the entity. However, Felix never really believed these stories. Though this would all change for Felix during one unfortunate yearly trip to Dire Island, where the Imperiati would all meet. Although Felix is very socially awkward, he still ended up in a friend group, which consists of other outcast teens that didn't fit in with all the other rich kids. This group ended up being labeled as the Pariahs. Instead of partaking in the various rich kid activities rich kids get up to, the Pariahs would instead spend their time wandering around Dire Island, digging through ruins trying to find secrets. During one expedition, the Pariahs ended up exploring an abandoned internment camp, where they discovered a lab where they discovered notes about horrific experiments conducted by the British East India Company during the First Opium War. And when the Pariahs opened a locked door, they discovered a room full of human remains and vials with a strange serum. Before the Pariahs could examine the serum, the entity then suddenly burst from the ground, and before anyone could react, several parents came to the Pariahs' rescue, including Felix's own parents, who fought back against the entity with bizarre tools. Although the parents did successfully fight off the entity, saving all the Pariahs, the consequence of this was that all the parents who fought the entity were all gone, seemingly taken to the realm. Although Felix and the other Pariahs tried to find answers to what happened, all their efforts were fruitless, leading to all 5 of them to drift apart, each going their own separate ways in life, dealing with the loss of their parents in their own ways. Felix's way of dealing with it was to blot the memory out of his head, focusing on his passion of architecture, which Felix was really talented at, even managing to get both the Swiss Architect Medal and the German National Design Award at just 23. However, despite being so talented, Felix ultimately realized his father was right about his introvertedness holding him back in life. Because of this, Felix would put on a facade in an effort to make him more appealing to clients. Despite being so popular and accomplished, Felix always had this looming feeling that he was a fraud, feeling as though he didn't really get anywhere with architectural skill. When Felix felt like an imposter, he drowned those thoughts out by spiraling out of control with partying and booze. The thing that ended up getting Felix's shit together, though, was when his girlfriend told him that he was going to be a father. So, to get his act together, Felix decided to find a big project that would lock in his legacy. And much to Felix's luck, some of Felix's dad's friends commissioned Felix's company to restore Dire Island. However, this job didn't end up going the way Felix had planned. As while he was surveying the island, he heard none other than his father through the ruins, and much to Felix's shock, he saw his father walk out through a cloud of fog. However, right as Felix was imagining showing his father all he accomplished in his unborn son, his father gave Felix a disappointed look and walked back into the fog, with Felix running in after him, where Felix then entered the entity's realm. Felix's lore is very fascinating, as he's one of the few people who've had a run-in with the entity and survived to tell the tale. I found it very interesting to see how Felix decided to cope with the loss of his parents by almost trying to forget about what happened by locking the fuck in with his architecture. What's also interesting about Felix's lore is how surprisingly relatable he is as a character. I mean, I don't really think many people can relate to being a rich kid who gets to constantly travel the world, but I think a lot of people can relate to Felix's social struggles with being an introvert who has to force himself to be social to become successful. Not only that, but it's also interesting to me how his lore goes into the relatable topic of struggling with imposter syndrome over being a world-class architect. I think many people have struggled with imposter syndrome when they've accomplished something big, whether it's doing well on an exam in school or achieving an ideal position at work. These aspects about Felix make him feel like an actual real human person, and not just some made-up guy. I really enjoyed Felix's lore, and I couldn't really identify any plot holes. So, because of the interesting aspects of his lore discussing his run-in with the entity as a teenager, and the extremely humanizing aspects of his lore, I'm happy to announce that Felix Richter is the first original survivor whose lore I will put in S tier. Up next, we've got the Blight, aka the Alchemist, aka Talbot Grimes. Oh god, the Blight. Ugh. Now look, I'm not saying that because his lore is bad or anything, but rather, he's probably the only character in the game who genuinely has the most lore out of anyone. And it's all spread throughout the whole game, with outfits, Halloween events, trailers, and tome lore. And that means for me, I'm gonna have to scour the entire goddamn game to find lore about Talbot to make sure I don't miss any key details. So let's get into it. Growing up in 19th century Scotland, Talbot discovered his love for alchemy at a very young age after foolishly consuming foxglove. And after being fascinated by how much damage one flower could do to him, with his newfound passion for alchemy, he eventually became enrolled in the London School of Medicine, where he greatly excelled. However, Talbot would go to extremes with his experiments at the school, where he would be reprimanded by the school for grave robbing, intending on experimenting with the corpses. However, before Talbot could face any serious consequences, thanks to his reputation, he would be enlisted by the British East India Company. It took him 7 years working for the company before he secured the position of head chemist. And during that time, he had to sometimes do some grunt work. One particular incident was when he was given a high-interest assignment by a man named Junius to collect a sample from something in northern Africa. Being interrupted from a dream about blue and purple flowers, Talbot assumed this was just a simple assignment that some other chemist could do. However, after being taken to the home of a rival and an old friend, a man named Tomas who was previously assigned to collect the sample, Talbot became very interested in the assignment, seeing how the assignment managed to break the mind of a very talented, intelligent chemist. With that, Talbot set off to northern Africa, reading Tomas's nonsensical notes about his time in the entity's realm, being forever hunted by various killers. During his travels to the location in northern Africa where he's supposed to collect the sample from, Talbot observes the British East India Company soldiers, and admires that they can get away with doing such atrocities with no consequences. When Talbot reaches his destination, he gets briefed on what his mission is, that being to collect samples from what's assumed to be a bleed between dimensions. The only thing that can be seen from the outside of this bleed is a thick black fog with a blue and purple glow emanating from it. Concerningly, Talbot is told that he actually isn't the first chemist sent to collect a sample from it, and that none of the men sent in had ever returned, with the exception of Tomas. Although reluctant, Talbot ultimately decided to attempt to collect a sample, with the promise of having test subjects for his experiments without punishment from the king. With that, Talbot and a few other men set off into the cloud of fog. Although some of the men seem very reluctant to enter the fog, Talbot attempts to rationalize it, and boldly steps in, where he's greeted by blue and purple vines wrapped around volcanic rock formations. And in suit, 2 of the 3 men walk through the fog after Talbot. While Talbot is collecting samples from the vines, one of the men makes a terrible decision to start hacking away at the vines with a machete. And much to Talbot's dismay, the vines reacted to the man's machete as if it were escaping danger. His thoughts that these vines were sentient were confirmed as the man with the machete had his entire leg ripped off from one of the vines that emerged from the ground. With a newfound interest in this strange place, Talbot didn't want to take the injured man back to camp. So, to prevent him and the surviving man from bringing the injured man to camp, Talbot made the injured man drink a poison, much to the shock and anger of the surviving man, who pulled a gun on Talbot. However, before the man could pull the trigger, the fog saves Talbot's life by dragging the man away into the fog. All alone, Talbot continues his journey into the realm, continuing to collect samples, where he then encounters none other than the man with the gun, who's begging for Talbot to save him, as he says that there's something that took the other 2 men with them, and did something with them, and that was going to do the same to him. As Talbot's treating the man's wounds, he suddenly has the idea to experiment on this man using some of the collected fluid from the vines, and pour some into the man's wounds. Although at first nothing happens, suddenly the man screams in agony as he mutates, covered in blue and purple pustules, as the man emits a blue light. At first, Talbot was fascinated by this, being in total amazement at what the substance could do to a person. But that quickly turns to regret and horror as he realized what he just did to another human being, putting them through such immense pain and suffering. With that, Talbot desperately scrambles to escape the fog, all while trying to justify himself that what he did was for the greater good. And as he was about to escape, he came face to face with a cloud of fog, which upon closer investigation, he realized that the fog was made up of tiny cells. But before he could observe any further, the fog dissipated to reveal a tree made up of all the missing chemists that were sent into the fog prior to Talbot. As he's staring in awe at the tree, Talbot then comes face to face with what attacked the man with the gun, which was a creature with a gaping mouth and glowing eyes, who appeared to almost recognize Talbot. Suddenly, vines erupt from the blind creature, which wraps around Talbot, leading him to blackout, and as he wakes up, he finds himself affixed to the tree, and in a haze, he collected whatever samples he could before the tree dissipates into a cloud of fog. With the success of this expedition, and Talbot proving to be a very skilled chemist for the British East India Company, he finally becomes promoted to being head chemist, where he's then granted a personal laboratory underneath an internment camp on Dyer Island, where prisoners of war from the First Opium War were sent. In this lab, Talbot performed experiments on the prisoners, where he developed a chemical that increased productivity in soldiers, with the teensy tiny side effect of sometimes the soldiers going mad and massacring whole-ass villages of people with bayonets. Although Talbot never blamed himself for these massacres caused by the side effects of the drug, many people did, and after a whole factory was massacred thanks to Talbot's drug, a man beat Talbot nearly to death and left him for dead in a mass grave, where he was then saved by 9 mystics who nursed him back to health, in a mystery school posing as a monastery. At this monastery, they learned of ways to use the human mind to explore dimensions. Indebted to the school, Talbot agreed to help the school research a chemical that is excreted from the pineal gland upon death. Although at first Talbot was simply paying off his debt to the school, this quickly became an obsession of his, to an almost unhealthy level. Because of his over-obsession and his eagerness for knowledge without wisdom, he was slowly condemned by the school, where eventually on one fateful night, he was taken to an opium den, where a hooded man forcefully injected Talbot with opium, and as Talbot awoke from his high, he immediately scrawled his notes of the chemical he's obsessing over onto the wall with a sharpened rock. Once Talbot covered the walls with his notes, he then carved the notes onto his own chest, and this led to a field of flowers appearing in front of him, which he stepped into, never to be seen again, leaving behind a wall covered in the same repeating phrase, "Death is only the beginning." Now, if this were any other character, this is where I give my thoughts and rank the lore. However, Talbot's story doesn't actually end here. We're only like 2/3 of the way through the lore of Talbot Grimes. So now let's get into Talbot's journey inside the Entity's realm. Not much is actually known about his early times in the Entity's realm for Talbot. However, we do know that Talbot was actually a survivor at one point, and at one point or another, Talbot actually managed to construct a lab outside the trials, where he'd experiment with the flora of the Entity's realm. We also know that at one point or another, Talbot discovers Vigo's lab, where he actually managed to get his hands on Vigo's journal, where it's likely that Talbot learned about the pustule flowers and the serum that could be made from it. With his newfound knowledge, every year these flowers would pop up, Talbot would extract as much serum from them as possible and experiment with them, sometimes testing on animals like rats or crows, and sometimes making concoctions with the serum using things like collected bile from the plague, or tincture made from the new moon bouquet offerings. Some of the most impressive experiments Talbot would perform in the realm, though, will be him somehow capturing killers and experimenting on them using the serum, managing to capture and inject some of the most menacing and theoretically impossible to capture killers, such as the Trapper or the Spirit. During his experiments, Talbot would grow more and more desperate to recreate the compound that Vigo created to presumably help him escape, as Talbot kept creating inferior compounds that, despite having interesting effects, weren't what Talbot was looking for. Eventually, it seems as though the entity discovered what Talbot was doing, and as punishment, she sent him to the Void. In the Void, Talbot would mindlessly and desperately seek out more pustule flowers so that he could continue his work, practically begging to do anything for just one more flower. Unfortunately for Talbot, in the Void, every time he'd find a flower, it would immediately crumble to dust in front of him, until eventually, after enough begging and fighting off mirages of opium addicts begging to do anything for a little bit more opium, he found flowers that wouldn't disintegrate. However, instead of plucking the flowers bound Talbot. And well restrained, he saw a vision of the 9 mystics looking at him with disappointment, reminding him of their words that he should not seek knowledge without wisdom. With that, the vines inject an immense amount of serum into Talbot, transforming him into the physically and mentally destroyed Blight, who's then thrown back into the trials, who this time, instead of being hunted, becomes a hunter. Talbot Grimes' lore is a very interesting tale about a man who flew way too close to the sun and got burnt to a crisp because of it. I've said this multiple times in this video, but I'm gonna say it again. I am a total sucker for brutal historical accuracy in lore. In the case of Talbot Grimes, it's a historical accuracy of the deplorable activity of the British East India Company during the 19th century leading to the First Opium War in 1839. This lore really goes into the depressingly accurate reality of what went on during the 19th century, with the British East India Company soldiers getting away with anything they wanted to, or the opium dens with several innocent people who had their lives ruined by a bunch of Brits selling them opium. Another thing I really liked about this lore is how it didn't end up being taken to the realm, but rather through potentially several years in the realm. It's very interesting to me how Talbot managed to be so tenacious against both the killers and the entity, to the point where he could even capture an experiment on killers. There is one glaring issue with Talbot's lore that has seriously irked me for the past like 2 years ever since it was introduced, and that's the part of his lore where he finds the purple and blue vines in North Africa. See, it's obvious that this is part of the entity and the entity's realm bleeding into reality, and this almost seemed to be something crucial to the entity. However, this is literally never expanded upon ever again, never to be even so much as being referenced ever again. However, I'm sure the second the community starts talking about this part of Talbot's lore, conveniently the next lore behavior cooks up will miraculously mention the blue and purple vines and serum. So because of this particular glaring issue, I'm gonna unfortunately have to bump down this easy S tier lore into A tier. Up next, we've got Elodie Rakoto, the survivor that practically the entire Dead by Daylight community seems to forget even exists. I never really understood why people ignore Elodie so much. She's a pretty neat character with some pretty interesting outfits. I guess it's simply just the Curse of the Binding of Kin chapter. Just nobody really gives much of a shit about anything that comes out of this DLC, I guess. Elodie grew up somewhere probably scarier than anywhere possible in the entity's realm. I'm of course talking about France. Growing up, Elodie had a passion for exploration, often ditching school to go explore around the city of Paris. One day, Elodie's parents dragged her alongside on a business trip to Dyer Island for a private meeting with the Imperiati. During this meeting, Elodie alongside Felix and some other kids formed the Pariahs. You already know how this goes and what happens next. They find Talbot's lab, they get attacked by the entity, their parents go away. Elodie would be constantly tormented with this memory of the disappearance of her parents. And while the pariahs like Felix would cope with the loss by trying to forget what happened, it became an obsession for Elodie for the next 14 years, trying to get to the bottom of what happened, ultimately being the last of the pariahs to try to find answers. Over the years, Elodie would amass a collection of artifacts and knowledge relating to what happened to her parents, eventually becoming employed by a man who seeks out ancient occult artifacts, who in return for retrieving artifacts for him would provide her with money and information. One particular job this man offered to Elodie was for her to retrieve the skull of a woman who was executed for giving birth to conjoined twins. Upon researching the skull, she discovered that the skull was somewhere inside the Paris catacombs, and with that, she embarked on a mission to retrieve the skull. However, when she was in the catacombs, despite her best efforts at evading them, she ended up getting jumped by none other than the Black Veil. As they were carrying her deeper into the catacombs, in a fit of desperation, Elodie bashed the one carrying her in the head with the skull. Although she escaped the hood figure's grasp, as she turned a corner, another member stabbed her. In a fit of desperation, she painted a symbol into the ground with her own blood to summon the entity. With that, the entity responded to Elodie's summoning of her and took Elodie into the realm. It's honestly really disappointing me that Elodie still doesn't have any tome lore because she really does have a lot of potential, practically being like an in-universe Indiana Jones or Nathan Drake or Lara Croft. Actually, funnily enough, I'll be getting into Laura's lore in a bit, but that's besides the point. I really like that this lore discusses the opposite end of the spectrum for the pariahs, with how they cope with the loss of their parents. It's honestly really sick that Elodie's lore expands upon the pariahs. It just sucks that sadly, much like the purple and blue vines from Blight's lore, behavior clearly forgot about them. I am a tad bit disappointed with Elodie's lore, not because it was bad or anything, but it really has a lot of potential that was never used. Although I'm really not fond of the pure walls of text that some modern characters' lores have, there's definitely room to expand on the lore of Elodie Rakoto. So because Elodie's lore is interesting, but left a lot of room to add on to her story, I'm gonna have to put her lore in B tier for now. And if behavior ever decides to remember her existence and make her tome for her, I'll be sure to change my ranking of her. Up next, we got the twins, aka Charlotte and Victor Deshays, aka please stop calling Victor a baby even though he literally died as a child canonically in the lore we ourselves wrote. Once again, much like Elodie, it seems like everyone kind of forgot the twins exist. Nobody ever plays them and behavior never makes cosmetics for them. To be fair though, unlike Elodie, I'm very glad nobody ever plays them, because holy fuck I want to cry when I'm forced to play Floor Simulator when playing against them. But that's besides the point. The twins were born under very unfortunate circumstances, being born as conjoined twins in 16th century France. Unrelated note, but maybe the reason why this chapter flopped is because all the fucking characters in it are from France. Disgusting! Because of the strong superstitions during that era, the twins were labeled as demons created by a witch, and from that point onward, they'd be constantly pursued by witch hunters. The coming years were very difficult for the family, having to survive by eating stolen food, cats, and sometimes a foraged stew of vegetables and bark. When witch hunters were near, the twins' mother forced a cloth in Charlotte's mouth to keep her silent. When the twins were just 5 years old, Charlotte had to be responsible for stealing food, as her mother was too ill to get food for them anymore. Although this was shortly lived, and not long after this, the witch hunters discovered where they were hiding, and with that, they burned the twins' mother alive and forced them to watch. When their mother died, the twins were then transported to a temple which housed none other than the Black Veil. During their time at the temple, for an unknown period of time, the twins were subjected to various experiments by the Black Veil, until one day the Black Veil were preparing to execute execute them. However, before they could kill Victor, Charlotte rolled over, and with that, Victor knocked over a candelabra, setting the entire temple ablaze. However, the struggles weren't over yet. As Charlotte struggled to greatly escape the inferno, she couldn't find the exit, leading to her to collapse onto her knees, and only then was she able to find the exit. Although Charlotte managed to escape the inferno mostly intact, Victor wasn't so lucky. Maybe he died from suffocation, or maybe it was the heat. It's not really too clear. Either way, Victor was dead as hell. Now, this is where the lore gets really fucky and confusing. According to their tome lore, after escaping the temple, Charlotte decides to head as far west as possible to sail westwards to a new world. With this plan in mind, Charlotte decides to go to a nearby town to steal some supplies needed for a journey westwards. However, as she's stealing supplies, a hunter finds her, and in a panic, Charlotte sets the town ablaze. As she's escaping the village, she tries to climb onto a plateau to camp on. And confusingly, even though in their base lore it states that Victor is already dead after escaping the inferno, in this tome lore, Victor's barely alive and signals to Charlotte that he needs something by tapping her on her shoulder as she's climbing. After resting for the night, Charlotte continued her journey to the coast, and during her travels, she finds a wolf left to die by hunters, with her pup mourning its mother. As a mercy, Charlotte hides the pup as she mercifully kills the dying wolf, and makes the pup run away. This act deeply upsets Charlotte, as she's not made for killing. The following morning, after resting, she gets awoken by none other than the hunter from the village sneaking up on her. As the hunter fires arrows at Charlotte, she attempts to evade the man, ultimately hiding behind a tree, preparing to ambush the man with a branch. When Charlotte gets a drop on the man, they clash briefly, with the man attempting to stab Charlotte with a hunting knife. This fight comes to a quick end though, the second a drop of blood lands on Victor, which causes Charlotte to lash out and rip the man's throat out with her own teeth, which, again, much like killing the wolf, seemed to deeply disturb Charlotte. Now, for whatever reason, Charlotte ended up giving up on her mission to sail west. Maybe it's because she came to terms with the fact that Victor was dead. I don't really know. Over the next several years, Charlotte would constantly fight for survival, often having to steal food to survive, and other times killing animals to use their guts for warmth. All the while, Victor continued to rot. When Charlotte became a teenager, she kept up this routine she had of thievery for survival, sometimes causing multiple people to die when a robbery went south. On one fateful winter night, Charlotte couldn't survive the elements. Being low on food and borderline freezing to death, Charlotte was finally ready to accept her death. As she was fading away, she was suddenly woken back up, with Victor violently thrashing and screaming, managing to rip himself out of her, running away. In utter disbelief, Charlotte pursued Victor until she saw him standing in front of a cloud of fog, where suddenly a hand reached down and grabbed him, causing Charlotte to angrily run in after him, thus plunging her into the entity's realm. Ugh, God, how many fucking times are we going to have a really good lore be absolutely shat on by stupid nonsensical tome lore? The twins had a very good base lore, and if they left it at that, they would be a very easy A or B tier lore. However, this entire tome lore completely ruins the quality of the twins' lore. First of all, what the fuck was the point of their lore being that Charlotte was eager to sail off westwards, and she ends up ultimately abandoning that mission in the end, never even explaining why she'd given up on this plan? Second of all, why the hell did behavior change Victor's fate with how in their base lore, Victor was dead right after escaping the temple, but in their tome lore, Victor is only on the brink of death? And speaking of which, it makes no damn sense why they miraculously aged up Charlotte and Victor to retcon the idea that Victor isn't a child, even though in the lore he died as a child. I know it doesn't explicitly state how old they were when they escaped the temple, or when Charlotte was escaping the hunter. However, given context clues, the twins can't be any older than like 7 years old max when they escaped the temple. However, despite this, in the tome cutscene, Charlotte's very clearly a grown-ass woman. Either that, or the world's tallest and buffest 7-year-old I've ever fucking seen in my entire life. Ugh, God, this tome lore really pisses me off so much. This might be really harsh for me to say, but I think I'm gonna have to put the twins' lore in like low C tier. Even though the whole idea of their lore is great, they'd be either A tier or B tier. This tome lore was such a fucking stinker that I need to put in low C. Actually, you know what? Screw it. After recording these voice lines, I actually think it belongs in the high D tier. Up next, we've got Yun-Jin Lee. So I'm gonna say right now, before I even get into the lore here, I do really enjoy Yun-Jin as a character. However, I think both her and Trickster started a trend that's gotten very fucking stale for me. And that's having original characters having extremely fucking intertwined lore. And I'm not talking intertwined the way Jeff and Legion are connected. I'm talking so intertwined that their lore is dependent on another character. You'll really hear me rant my ass off on this when we get into Toledo and Renato Lyra, and how I hate that their whole personalities are that they're each other's siblings who love kites. Okay, enough about the siblings I hate. Let's talk about Yun-Jin. From a very early age, Yun-Jin had a passion for music. However, when she was 10, all of her instruments were taken by debt collectors, as her family was very poor and deep in debt. However, much to her luck, at 17, her high school was visited by a record label to audition potential talent. Despite being rejected as an idol, she did end up getting a position as an unpaid intern at the label, and over the following years, she ended up producing some of the best songs the company ever made, with her receiving zero recognition for any of it. Because of this, she decided to wear flamboyant outfits and add a producer tag to the music she produced, which ended up making her a recognized icon in the music world. With her success, success, she decided to help boost a failing boy band called No Spin. With the realization that No Spin was too generic sounding, she ended up boosting them to stardom by adding a new member who would spice up the band, that being Ji-woon Hak. Thanks to his decision of Yun-Jin, No Spin's first album was a record-breaking success, with their first music video being such a hit that secured Yun-Jin as being a very high-quality music producer. The overnight success led to the band having promotional items made for them, like a limited edition soda, and most importantly, it also led to the band to work on their next album. However, on one tragic day, the recording studio caught fire, causing Yun-Jin to quickly rush employees and, most importantly, herself out of the burning building. It was only then after escaping the fire when she realized that the members of No Spin were still in the building, where nearly every single one of them died, with the sole survivor being Ji-woon. In a selfish fit of desperation to save her career and reputation, she decided to take Ji-woon under her wing and rebrand him as a solo act. This rebranding was a resounding success, with Ji-woon having his first solo music video saying goodbye to each member of No Spin under his brand new stage name, The Trickster. Following this new success, Yun-Jin and Ji-woon would tour the world, and although everywhere they traveled would end up being a success for them, everywhere they traveled to would also lead to bizarre and horrific murders following them. Assuming it to be a deranged stalker, Yun-Jin would increase their security, to no avail. Each murder ended up being consistently disturbing, one of the most memorable ones being when a victim had diamond cufflinks gouged into their eyes. This specific murder really set the gears in Yun-Jin's head in motion, as a video from the victim's social media was all over the news, and when Yun-Jin listened to Ji-woon's latest song, she realized the screams in the intro sound eerily similar to the victim's screams in the social media video. With this, she realized that Ji-woon was very likely the supposed stalker fan murdering people. However, because of her selfish desperation to protect her career, Yun-Jin attempted to rationalize and pretend she didn't know what Ji-woon got up to. During one fateful tour to Rio de Janeiro, Yun-Jin received threatening emails from the supposed stalker that was following her and Ji-woon everywhere they went. Despite this threat, she continues on as business as usual, and as she's walking through the recording studio her and Ji-woon were recording at, she discovers a very talented musician being instructed poorly by another somewhat well-known producer, which leads Yun-Jin to hand the musician her business card. That night, as Yun-Jin drowns herself in booze, she replays the news reports of the murders in her mind again and again, finding them to have lots of evidence that always pointed back to Ji-woon. And when her thoughts were interrupted by security telling her that Ji-woon left the hotel, she immediately decided to do her own investigation on him. During a rehearsal, Yun-Jin sneaks off and into Ji-woon's room, where she discovers clothes she'd never seen him wear before, a whetstone, and disturbingly, a computer with the sounds of screams on it. As she's investigating, Ji-woon walks in, and although he seems irritated, Yun-Jin plays into the act of a concerned producer scolding him for wandering off at night, lulling him into a false sense of security. After this close call, Yun-Jin activates a tracker she put on Ji-woon's phone, and when she saw he wasn't at the hotel anymore, Yun-Jin chased after him. During her pursuit, she ended up crashing the car she was driving, and following the crash, she receives a text from Ji-woon, with the only word being help. With the revelation that maybe Ji-woon was actually kidnapped by the supposed stalker that sent her the threatening email, she immediately continued her pursuit of him, this time in hopes of saving him. When Ji-woon's tracker stops moving, she approaches multiple abandoned warehouses, and in the parking lot, she sees none other than the Blight business card she handed that musician the other day. As she frantically searches for Ji-woon, she hears sirens approaching. When Yun-Jin finally finds the warehouse Ji-woon's in, she's greeted by the sight of the musician she met previously preparing to stab Ji-woon. But before he could, the cops arrive, and they shoot the musician, seemingly saving Ji-woon's life. However, Yun-Jin notices the knife that the musician was going to stab Ji-woon with, and realizes that was the exact same knife Ji-woon had during a performance. Sometime after this incident, the executives at the record label are putting pressure on Yun-Jin to tone down Ji-woon's disturbing and violent character, as he believed it to be the source of the faltering revenue of the company. Even though she did agree it was too much, she lied to Ji-woon, saying she tried her best to defend him, but was outnumbered. And for the next 3 months, they attempted to make another success for the company. Once the months passed, it was time for her to present their latest song at a private show for the executives. But right as she realized something was off, the room filled with smoke, which incapacitated everyone in the room, herself included. Well incapacitated, she could only helplessly watch as Ji-woon violently murdered and mutilated every single one of the executives and staff members in the room. Although at first she was mortified, she quickly became full of rage, knowing that everything was him from the start, feeling hatred less over the fact she allowed a murderer to be free, but rather feeling hatred over how Ji-woon took everything from her. With this feeling of hatred, she made a promise that he would suffer for what he did. And with that, a fog engulfed her, with the sound of a crowd cheering her producer name, leaving her happy and willing to accept the darkness that was taking her, and thus she enters the entity's realm. Wow. When I first read Yun-Jin's lore, I was genuinely impressed that Behavior decided to actually make a pretty terrible person be a survivor instead of another selfless goody two-shoes. Despite what I said about my dislike for lore that has other characters be reliant on one another to make their lore work, I think it works really well with Yun-Jin and Ji-woon. Yun-Jin's lore is very well executed, with getting the reader into the head of someone who so selfishly wants to keep their wealth and success that they let someone as genuinely depraved and evil as Ji-woon Hak roam free in this world, continually letting him get away with murders again and again. I really don't have anything bad to say about Yun-Jin's lore. This was probably one of the most engaging survivor lores I've read so far, and I even really enjoyed how her tome lore was interesting and didn't just completely ruin her existing lore, like what had been done time and time again with so many other characters. Looking at you, twins! So because of how different and engaging Yun-Jin's lore is, I can't in good conscience place her lore anywhere lower than S tier. Up next, we got the Trickster, aka Ji-Woon Hak. Man, I remember when Trickster just released and everyone was losing their minds over how he wasn't scary in the slightest. But as someone who at the time was like the biggest lore buff ever, I knew that even though he wasn't necessarily the most physically terrifying character the game had to offer, I'm fairly certain that Ji-Woon has one of, if not the most disturbing lores the game has to offer, telling the story of a genuinely disgusting individual, potentially even rivaling the depravity of someone like Danny Johnson the Ghostface. Throughout his entire life, Ji-Woon was what we call in the business an attention whore. Even as a young kid who was actually a bit introverted and scared of attention, during his show and tell at school, he killed his classmate's hamster because his peers cared more about the hamster than his flute he was playing. It's not very clear when Ji-Woon gained more confidence, but sometime later he helped bring business to his family's restaurant by performing by using throwing knives, bringing gullible tourists into the business. As a reward for this, Ji-Woon's father paid for Ji-Woon to have singing and dancing lessons, which he excelled at, and eventually he got picked up by the producer Yun-Jin Lee. Almost immediately, him and his band that he was recruited into became an overnight success. However, Ji-Woon was gradually feeling very bitter about it, feeling anger over the fact that his fans' adoration were divided 5 ways instead of it all being on him. Despite this resentment, he still kept up appearances. However, on one fateful day, after taking a long lunch break after a recording session, Ji-Woon smelled burning wires and realized that the recording studio was on fire. At first, Ji-Woon genuinely did attempt to heroically save his bandmates, and when he saw the door of the room that they were trapped in was blocked by fallen speakers, he attempted to move them, until he realized they were all screaming his name, which he absolutely adored and ultimately decided to not save them. Following the fire, Ji-Woon thrived being known as someone who attempted to save his bandmates from a fire. And thanks to Yun-Jin, Ji-Woon thrived being a solo act under the new stage name of the Trickster. The newfound popularity wasn't the only thing Ji-Woon was craving. Following the deaths of his bandmates he caused, Ji-Woon also craved murder. But not just any kind of murder, Ji-Woon preferred torturing victims to death for hours on end. His first, technically 5th victim didn't really die how he planned, as his victim was gagged, and Ji-Woon couldn't hear his screams. So, he improved his methods and decided instead to take his victims to abandoned warehouses, where he'd record the screams of his victims, finding genuine enjoyment and artistic beauty from the sounds his victims would make. What made Ji-Woon's murders so much more depraved than they already were, was how he'd incorporate the screams of his victims that he'd record into his own music, masking them with synthesizing and burying them under melodies so that nobody would be the wiser. Strangely enough, Ji-Woon wasn't exactly trying to get away with his murders, as he would very intentionally leave behind clues for the cops to come catch him, ranging from leaving behind a feather boa from a recent photo shoot on one of his victims, to leaving his expensive obscure designer headphones on a dead folk singer. Thanks to Yun-Jin, all these murders would simply be chalked up to being a crazy stalker fan, which worked in Ji-Woon's favor. During that fade trip to Rio de Janeiro, Ji-Woon had been playing to murder the musician that Yun-Jin had met, and when he came face to face with Yun-Jin in his hotel room, he tried to deceive her, feigning grief over the dead members of No Spin, which he believed worked on her. And ironically, knowing Yun-Jin's side of the story, we know that she thought she was the one deceiving him. That night, Ji-Woon gets a jump on the musician he was planning on killing, but to his disappointment and shock, he sees Yun-Jin's car pulling up. So in haste, Ji-Woon speeds off, irritated and quickly coming up with a plan on the spot. To his irritation, as much as he wants to torture the musician to capture his screams, he also knows that Yun-Jin is probably still in hot pursuit, and so begrudgingly, he decides last second to stage his kidnapping, which went exactly in Ji-Woon's favor. Following this close call, Ji-Woon finds out through Yun-Jin that the executives at the label are fed up with him, and that he has to make one more song that'll impress them, much to his anger. Because of this, Ji-Woon planned out the murder by paying a vet an extremely large amount of money for nitrous oxide. Is Ji-Woon stupid? Doesn't he know galaxy gas exists? After bribing the stage technician for allowing Ji-Woon access into the private theater, Ji-Woon set up the nitrous, and after running a bit late to the show, he turned everyone into Kanye West. And once everyone was sedated, he bound everyone, and as a reward for always supporting him, allowed Yun-Jin to be the only audience member to watch the bloodbath that Ji-Woon was about to create. During his massacre, Ji-Woon cherished every single sound the victims made, as he slaughtered each and every single one of them, all while Yun-Jin watched in anger. And as he finally killed the last victim, he bowed and turned his attention to Yun-Jin, who he saw as being a loose end. However, right as he was about to kill her, he gets enveloped in a fog, being shown unaltered versions of the entity's realm, much to his delight. And with that, Ji-Woon gladly enters the entity's realm. You know, I really love Ji-Woon's lore a lot. It's weirdly refreshing to see a killer in Dead by Daylight who literally just kills because of their sick, twisted ego. Not some sad trauma or daddy issues like so many of the other killers in the game. I also really love the similarities between Ji-woon and Yun-Jin in their tome lores, with how they both thought they were fooling each other. However, unlike Yun-Jin's lore, Ji-woon's lore does still have an issue that I think is very glaring, and that's how he manages to get away with his murders so often. It makes sense why someone equally as evil as him, such as Danny Johnson, gets away with their killings, because they make a strong effort not to leave behind enough information to let themselves get caught. Ji-woon, on the other hand, left behind so much evidence that theoretically he should have been caught after the Feather Boa murder. There's literally no excuse or rationale for how he gets away with these killings so often. You can't even use the he's rich and famous card for this, because I feel like when it comes to serial killing, even O.J. Simpson couldn't get away with it. So because of this frankly very egregious plot hole, I'm gonna have to bump down Ji-woon's lore from S tier to B tier. Alright, I feel like this is a good stopping point for now. This is what the tier list looks like so far. Once again, if you disagree with my rankings and opinions, feel free to let me know in the comments down below. Just remember that it won't matter because I'm right and you're wrong. Anyways, be sure to stay tuned for the final part of the series for the time being. Thank you all so much for watching if you still are, and until next time.